The sun over the Arizona Territory is not a gentle thing. It's a hammer, an anvil, a forge that beats the life out of the land and anything left upon it. For Jocelyn Bellwether, it was a funeral pyre. The last thing she remembered was the coppery taste of her own blood and the hollow laughter of a man named Wade as he tossed her from the wagon. They left her for the buzzards and the coyotes, a secret buried under a sky as vast and empty as a dead man's eyes. But the prairie holds more than just death. As her world faded to black, another pair of eyes filled with a pain as deep as her own watched from the rocks. He was a ghost, a wounded Apache warrior, and he was about to become her last and most unlikely salvation. The dust of St. Louis had barely settled on Jocelyn Bellwether's traveling clothes when she realized her marriage was not a union, but a purchase. Barrett Coleman was a man carved from the same hard rock he sought to blast from the mountainsides, handsome, unyielding, and with a core of pure, cold ambition. He was a titan of industry, with interests in silver mines, cattle ranches, and the railroads that stitched the nation together. He'd courted her with promises of a life of adventure and purpose in the West, a stark contrast to the stifling drawing rooms of her Boston upbringing. Her father, a shipping merchant deep in Coleman's debt, had called it a magnificent match. Jocelyn, with a spirit too wild for the East, had called it an escape. She soon learned she had only traded one cage for another, this one with sharper edges and a more unforgiving lock. Barrett didn't want a wife. He wanted an ornament, a testament to his good taste, and a hostess for the powerful men he courted. Any opinion she offered was met with a patronizing smile. Any desire for independence was crushed with a velvet-gloved hand that could, in the privacy of their opulent San Francisco home, just as easily become a fist. The breaking point came during a dinner with Senator Thomas W. Patterson of Colorado. Jocelyn, having read extensively about the plight of miners in the San Juan Mountains, dared to question the senator about safety conditions. Barrett's smile never wavered, but his fingers gripped her arm under the table with the force of a branding iron. Later that night, his rage was quiet, which was far more terrifying than his shouting. "You are a reflection of me, Jocelyn," he'd whispered, his face inches from hers. "And my reflection does not have opinions. It doesn't speak out of turn. It will be beautiful, silent, and obedient. Do you understand?" In that moment, she understood everything. She wasn't his partner. She was his property, and property that misbehaves is broken. Her escape was an act of desperate, meticulous planning. For months, she skimmed small amounts from the household accounts, feigning miscalculations. She stitched banknotes into the hem of her plainest traveling dress. She learned of a wagon train, the Pioneer Hope Express, heading east from Sacramento, carrying families seeking a new start back in Missouri. It was the perfect cover, a lone woman, supposedly a recent widow, returning to family. She paid her passage to a man named Jedediah Smith, a grizzled but seemingly kind wagon master. For 3 weeks the plan worked. The rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels was a lullaby of freedom. She shared meals with the Davidsons, a family of farmers with 5 children, and listened to their simple, hopeful dreams. She felt the sun on her face, not through the paned glass of a mansion window, but as a real, warming presence. She was becoming herself again. The trouble started in the Arizona Territory. 2 new men joined the train at a dusty outpost, claiming to be hired guards for the treacherous stretch ahead. The leader was a man with a jagged scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. He called himself Wade. His companion was a quiet, hulking man they called Pike. Jocelyn felt a prickle of unease. They didn't have the look of protectors. They had the hungry eyes of wolves. She saw them talking to the wagon master, Jedediah, their heads close together. Money was exchanged. Jedediah stopped meeting her gaze after that. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. The attack came 2 days later, not from the outside, but from within. As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, Wade and Pike rode alongside her wagon. Evening Mrs. Bellwether Wade said, his voice slick with false courtesy. "Quite the view." "It is Jocelyn," replied her hand, instinctively tightening on the small satchel containing her savings. "Mr. Coleman sends his regards," Wade continued, and the world fell out from under her. "He's a man who dislikes loose ends. Says you've been misplaced. He paid us a handsome sum to find you." Jedediah Smith watched from the front of the train, his face a mask of shame, doing nothing. The Davidsons huddled with their children, their faces pale with terror. They were simple folk, no match for armed men. "What do you want?" Jocelyn's voice trembled. Mr. Coleman was very specific. Pike grunted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "He doesn't want you back. He wants you gone. An unfortunate accident on the trail." "Tragic." Wade's sneer widened. "We're to make it look like an Apache raid. They'll get the blame. They always do. They dragged her from the wagon. She fought, kicking and scratching a wildcat cornered. It was useless. Pike struck her across the face, and the world exploded in a flash of white, hot pen. They took her satchel, her locket, anything of value." Wade held her by the hair, forcing her to look at him. "Tell Mr. Coleman." She gasped, blood filling her mouth. "Tell him I curse his name." Wade laughed. It was a sound scraped from the bottom of a grave. "He won't care." With a final brutal shove, he threw her down the rocky embankment at the side of the trail. Her head struck a rock with a sickening crack. She tumbled through sagebrush and sharp stones, her world spiraling into a vortex of pain and darkness. The last thing she heard was the sound of the wagons creaking away, leaving her behind. The sun was a merciless eye in the sky. The silence of the prairie descended, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the distant patient circling of a vulture. Jocelyn Bellwether, the woman who had dared to escape, lay broken and still left for dead in the heart of nowhere. But her story wasn't over. Unseen from a high ledge overlooking the trail, a pair of dark eyes had witnessed the entire betrayal. Eyes that belonged to a man who knew better than anyone what it meant to be left with nothing but a thirst for vengeance. The man's name was Taza. It was not the name he was born with, but the one he had earned. In the language of his people, the Chiricahua Apache, it meant strong. He did not feel strong now. He felt hollowed out, a vessel filled only with grief and the burning fire of a festering bullet wound in his shoulder. 3 days ago, he'd had a family. A wife, Nalin, whose laughter was like the sound of a running stream. A son, 6 years old, named Bien, who was just learning to track rabbits. They were a small band, not warriors, just families who had refused the slow death of the reservation at San Carlos, choosing the freedom and hardship of their ancestral lands. The white men had come at dawn. They weren't soldiers in blue coats. They were harder men with rifles that fired faster than any cavalry carbine. They wore the brand of the Coleman Mining Corporation on their saddlebags. They said the land was needed for a new silver vein. They called Taza's people trespassers. They didn't even offer to relocate them. They simply opened fire. Taza had fought back with the ferocity of a cornered mountain lion, but his old rifle was no match for their repeating Henrys. He'd seen Nalin fall. He'd seen Bien cut down as he ran for the safety of the rocks. A bullet had torn through Taza's shoulder, spinning him around. He had crawled into a narrow crevice, bleeding and delirious, listening to the screams of his people fade into an agonizing silence. When he finally emerged, all that was left were smoking wickiups and the bodies of everyone he had ever loved. He was the last of his band. A ghost. He had been tracking the killers for 2 days, driven by a singular, cold, purpose revenge. The wound in his shoulder throbbed with infection, and fever was a constant shimmering haze at the edge of his vision. He knew he was dying, but he would not die alone. He would take the men with the Coleman brand with him. It was from his hiding place, a high rocky outcrop that gave him a commanding view of the trail, that he witnessed the betrayal of the white woman. He watched with detached curiosity as the wagon train stopped. He saw the men with the sneering faces, the ones he recognized from the massacre. Wade and Pike. They worked for the same master. The brand was the same. He watched them drag the woman out. He saw her fight. There was spirit in her, a fire that reminded him, for a fleeting, painful moment, of Nolan. He watched them cast her aside like garbage and leave her to the elements. His first instinct was to do nothing. She was one of them, the Ende, the White Eyes who had taken everything from him. Her people were a plague upon the land. Why should he care if they devoured their own? Let the sun and the scavengers claim her. It was a fitting end in this land of ghosts. He remained hidden until the dust from the wagon train was a faint smudge on the horizon. The silence returned. He was about to move on to continue his grim pursuit when a sound reached him. A faint, shuddering moan. She was still alive. Something stirred within him, a conflict he didn't want. To leave her was simple. To help her was a complication he could not afford. She was his enemy, but the men who had left her here were his enemies too. They shared the same brand of oppressor. He looked at her crumpled form, so far from the trail, so utterly helpless. He thought of his own family left unburied. There was a code older than the hatred for the white man, a code of the desert. Nothing should be left to suffer needlessly. Not a deer with a broken leg, not a hawk with a torn wing. With a grunt of pain, Taza shifted his weight, his wounded shoulder sending a fresh wave of agony through him. He made his decision. It was not born of pity or compassion, but of something far more primal. Perhaps it was a defiance against the men who had destroyed his world. They had decided this woman would die. Taza, by his own will, would decide otherwise. It was a small act of power in a world that had stripped him of all of it. He carefully made his way down the rocky slope. His movements were fluid and silent, the moccasins on his feet making no sound on the gravelly earth. He approached her cautiously, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. She was a mess of blood and dirt. Her fine dress was torn, her blonde hair matted and dark with blood from a wound on her head. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her face. Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment, her blue eyes clouded with pain, and confusion focused on him. He saw terror dawn in them. Of course. To her, he was the savage from her nightmares, the very thing her attackers had planned to frame. "No, please." She whispered the words, a faint rasp. Taza said nothing. The gulf between their languages was as wide as the prairie itself. He reached out not to her, but to the canteen on her belt, which her attackers had missed. It was nearly empty. He placed a hand gently, yet firmly, on her uninjured shoulder, a silent command to be still. He then used his knife to carefully cut a strip of cloth from her petticoat. He had no medicine, only the knowledge of the land. He rose and walked to a patch of yucca plants, using his knife to dig up a piece of the root. Chewing it into a coarse poultice, he returned and applied it to the gash on her head. It would sting, but it would help to cleanse the wound. She flinched, but didn't have the strength to pull away. Her terror was slowly being replaced by a dazed bewilderment. The hardest part was next. He needed to move her. She was dead weight, and his own body was screaming in protest. Gritting his teeth against the fire in his shoulder, he managed to get his good arm under her knees and his wounded one as best he could around her back. He lifted. The pain was blinding, a white-hot nova that exploded behind his eyes. He stumbled, but he did not fall. He carried her away from the open ground towards the shelter of the same rocky outcrop where he had watched her fall. Every step was an ordeal. Her head rested against his chest, her shallow breaths warming his skin. He was a wounded man, carrying a half-dead woman, two broken souls in a landscape that had no mercy for weakness. He didn't know if he was carrying her to safety, or if they were just two ghosts walking together towards the same inevitable grave. But for the first time in 3 days, he was doing something other than just hunting. He was trying to keep something alive. The days that followed blurred into a fever dream of pain, thirst, and suffocating heat. Taza found a shallow cave, little more than an overhang of rock that offered shelter from the relentless sun. He laid Jocelyn down on the cool stone floor. Her fever was high. She drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering names he didn't understand. Barrett, father, and sometimes crying out in terror. Taza's own fever was a constant companion. The bullet wound in his shoulder was angry and swollen, the skin around it a dark, bruised purple. He knew if the poison spread he would die. He tended to his own wound as he tended to hers with a stoic desperation. He found a broad-leafed plant, crushing the leaves to make a green paste that he packed into the weeping hole in his flesh. It was an old remedy. It might work, it might not. Their communication was a silent, desperate pantomime. There was no common tongue between them. Their language was one of gestures of necessity, of shared suffering. When Jocelyn's fever was at its worst, he would use the last of their water to dampen a cloth and press it to her forehead. When he collapsed from the pain in his own shoulder, she, in a moment of lucidity, managed to reach the canteen and hold it to his lips. The first time she was truly awake, she saw him sitting by the mouth of the cave, sharpening his knife on a flat stone. The metallic rasp was the only sound. Fear ingrained and absolute seized her. He was an Apache. She had been raised on terrifying stories of their savagery. Yet this man hadn't harmed her. He had saved her. The contradiction was a dizzying puzzle her fever-addled mind couldn't solve. He saw her watching him. His dark eyes met hers, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. His face was a mask of exhaustion and pain, etched with lines of grief she couldn't possibly comprehend. She saw the dirty bandage on his shoulder and understood. He was wounded too. They were two sides of the same coin, discarded by the world. He pointed a finger at his chest. "Taza," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. She understood. He was giving her his name. She pointed a trembling finger at herself. "Jocelyn." He nodded slowly. A name. It was the first brick laid in a bridge across an impassable canyon. Survival became a relentless rhythm. Water was the first god they served. Taza knew how to find it. He'd lead her stumbling and weak to the base of a rock formation, where a seep of moisture dampened the earth. They would spend an hour digging with flat stones, their hands raw and bleeding until a small, muddy puddle collected at the bottom. The water was warm and tasted of minerals, but it was life. Food was the second. He showed her how to find the edible parts of a prickly pear cactus, using 2 sticks to expertly knock off the spiny fruit and roll it in the sand to remove the fine needles. He dug for roots she would have never recognized. One evening, using a simple but effective snare, he fashioned from a strip of his own leather leggings, he caught a rabbit. He killed it quickly, cleanly. Jocelyn, who would have once felt faint at the sight of blood, watched with a kind of numb fascination. He built a small, smokeless fire in the cave, using a hand drill, with a patience that was mesmerizing. The smell of roasting meat filled the small space, a scent so rich and intoxicating it made her weep. He offered her the first piece. It was tough and gamey, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. As they ate in silence, sharing the small creature, another brick was laid on the bridge. They were no longer just a white woman and an Apache warrior. They were two hungry people eating. It was a communion more profound than any she had known in a church. The nights were cold. They had no blankets. They would huddle on opposite sides of the small fire, the flames dancing in their eyes. During those long, silent hours, Jocelyn's mind would race. She would see Barrett's cold smile, hear Wade's hollow laugh. The rage and grief would wash over her in waves. But then she would look across the fire at the silent, wounded man who had saved her, and the emotions would quiet. His stillness was a comfort. He seemed to carry a grief so immense it made his own physical pain a secondary concern. One night, a rattlesnake slithered into the relative warmth of the cave. Jocelyn froze, a scream caught in her throat. Before she could even make a sound, Taza moved with a speed that was terrifying and beautiful. In one fluid motion, he snatched a burning branch from the fire and flung it at the snake. The serpent startled, and angry coiled, and hissed its rattle a dry, deadly whisper. Taza didn't hesitate. His knife was in his hand, a blur of motion in the firelight. The snake's head was severed before it could strike. He kicked the twitching body out of the cave, his chest heaving. He looked at Jocelyn, his eyes asking if she was harmed. She shook her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. He gave a single curt nod and went back to his side of the fire as if nothing had happened. In that moment, her fear of him vanished, completely replaced by a deep and humbling respect. He was not the savage of her stories. He was a survivor. He was a protector. As their bodies slowly healed, a fragile trust began to grow. He started to teach her, using gestures and single words. He'd point to the sky, Ya the sun, G the water, Tu. She would repeat the words, her tongue clumsy around the sounds. She in turn would point to her heart and say, "Thank you." He seemed to understand. One afternoon, while resting, he took a piece of charcoal from the fire and began to draw on the flat wall of the cave. He drew stick figures, a man, a woman, a small child. He drew a wickiup, their traditional home. Then he drew other figures, men with rifles, and he drew fire. He made a sound, a low, guttural cry of anguish that seemed torn from the very depths of his soul. He dragged a finger across the charcoal figures of his family, smudging them into oblivion. Jocelyn watched her own heart aching in sympathy. She finally understood the source of the profound sadness in his eyes. He wasn't just wounded in the shoulder. His entire world had been burned to the ground. She reached out and for the first time touched his arm. It was a simple gesture of shared humanity, of acknowledging a pain too deep for words. He did not pull away. They sat there in the fading light, a white woman from Boston and a Chiricahua warrior, their shared and separate tragedies laid bare on a stone wall in the middle of the Arizona desert. The Prairie had tried to kill them both, but in its crucible, it was forging something new, an alliance born not of choice, but of the desperate, stubborn will to live. After nearly 2 weeks in the wilderness, they were alive, but only just. Their bodies were scarred and thin, but their wounds were closing, and a tough, resilient strength had taken root in them. Taza, through sheer force of will and knowledge of the land, had pulled them both back from the brink. Jocelyn felt like she had been flayed, stripped of her old self, and remade by the harsh landscape. The feel of silk and the clink of teacups were memories from another lifetime, belonging to a woman she no longer recognized. Taza knew they couldn't survive indefinitely, as ghosts in the rocks. They needed supplies, real food, clean water, and perhaps a horse, if they were to have any chance of truly escaping. His goal was unchanged: find the men who killed his family, Wade and Pike, and the man they worked for. Jocelyn's goal was simpler and more complex: to live, and to figure out what living now meant. He led them north, following the faint, distant outline of a mountain range he knew. At its base, he had said, with a single word and a gesture, was a town. Kaskiye, a white man's town. The journey was arduous. They traveled by night, resting during the crushing heat of the day. The transition from the raw, honest danger of the wilderness to the outskirts of civilization was jarring. They saw the tracks of shod horses, the ruts of wagon wheels, the discarded refuse of travelers. To Jocelyn, it was a sign of hope. To Taza, it was a warning. The town was called Prosperity. It was a name dripping with an irony that felt like a physical slap. It was a raw, ugly collection of unpainted wooden buildings, huddled along a single dusty main street, a scar on the face of the landscape. It had sprung up almost overnight to service the new Coleman silver mine in the hills. The CMC brand was everywhere, on the flank of the water tower, on the sign of the largest saloon, on the crates being unloaded from a freight wagon. Barrett's shadow fell even here in the middle of nowhere. Jocelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This wasn't a refuge. It was an extension of her cage. They watched the town from a ridge as dusk fell. Taza's plan was simple. He would wait until the darkest part of the night and try to steal what they needed from a stable or a mercantile back room. He was a phantom. He could move through the town unseen. But Jocelyn knew it was too risky. He was still weak, and if he were caught, an Apache warrior found stealing in a town owned by Barrett Coleman would be hanging from a rope before sunrise. "No," she said the English word sharp. She shook her head, then pointed to herself, then to the town. "I will go." Taza looked at her, his expression unreadable. He pointed to her blonde hair, her blue eyes. She was a white woman, yes, but she was also disheveled, dressed in rags, with the sun-darkened skin and wild look of someone who had been through an ordeal. She would draw questions that could lead back to the wagon train, back to Wade and Pike. She tried to explain with a flurry of gestures. She would cover her hair. She would keep her head down. She could trade something for food. She still had a small, plain silver ring on her finger, one Barrett had never noticed a gift from her grandmother. It was all she had left of her old life. Their silent argument was interrupted by the sight of two riders entering the town. Even from a distance, Jocelyn recognized the swagger of the man in the lead. The way he sat his horse, the angle of his hat. It was Wade. His hulking shadow Pike rode beside him. They dismounted in front of the saloon, laughing, and swaggered inside. Jocelyn's blood ran cold. They were here. Of all the towns in the territory, they were here. It wasn't a coincidence. They worked for Coleman. This was Coleman's town. Taza had seen them too. His body went rigid, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. A low, dangerous sound emanated from his chest, the growl of a predator that has found its prey. The fever for revenge burned in his eyes. Jocelyn grabbed his arm. "No," she whispered fiercely. "Not now. Not like this." He was one man still injured against at least two in a town full of men loyal to their paymaster. It was suicide. He looked from the saloon back to her, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. The need for vengeance was a living thing inside him, clawing to be set free. But he looked at Jocelyn, at her pale, determined face, and saw the same enemy reflected in her eyes. Their fight was the same fight, but it had to be fought with cunning, not just rage. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. The hunt would wait. Their immediate problem was more pressing. They were trapped. Wade and Pike were in the town below, and their presence meant that Coleman's influence was absolute here. There would be no help, no law to appeal to. As darkness settled, they crept closer, taking shelter behind a livery stable at the edge of town. The sounds and smells were overwhelming after the silence of the Prairie tinny piano music, drunken laughter, the scent of stale beer and frying meat. It was from this vantage point that Jocelyn saw something that made her heart stop. Nailed to the sheriff's office door under the flickering light of a lantern was a piece of paper. A notice. Driven by a dreadful curiosity, she crept closer, using the shadows of the water trough to shield her. It was a death notice. It mourned the tragic loss of Mrs. Jocelyn Coleman, beloved wife of the esteemed Barrett Coleman, who was brutally murdered during an Apache raid on the Pioneer Hope Express wagon train. It spoke of her gentle spirit and her charitable nature. It offered a substantial reward, $500 for the capture, dead or alive, of the savage redskin responsible for the attack. The description below was vague, but it was clearly meant to be of an Apache warrior. Any Apache warrior. The lie was so audacious, so complete, it stole her breath. Barrett hadn't just tried to kill her. He had erased her, rewritten her ending, and turned her into a martyr to serve his own reputation. He had even used her death as an excuse to put a bounty on the head of any man who looked like Taza. She backed away into the shadows, her mind reeling. She was a ghost. Officially, legally, she was dead. And the man who had saved her life was now a wanted murderer for a crime he didn't commit. They weren't just running from Barrett anymore. They were running from the world he had created, a world where the truth was, whatever he paid for it to be. The town of Prosperity was not a sanctuary. It was their tomb, waiting to be sealed. The death notice changed everything. They were no longer simply survivors. They were fugitives, hunted by a lie more potent than any posse. Jocelyn returned to Taza, her face grim, and tried to explain what she had seen. She pointed to the poster, then to him, and made a gesture of a rope around her neck. He understood immediately. The trap was not just for her. It was for him, too. His quest for vengeance and her fight for life were now inextricably, fatally intertwined. They needed an ally, however temporary. A desperate plan began to form in Jocelyn's mind. She had noticed a small building at the quieter end of the street, its shingle reading, Dr. Henry Mead, physician and surgeon. A doctor, a man of education, perhaps a man who operated on a code higher than Coleman's silver dollars. It was a wild gamble, but it was the only one they had. Leaving Taza hidden in the deep shadows of the smithy with a promise to return, Jocelyn walked into the open. She pulled her shawl over her hair, kept her head down, and tried to look like any other weary traveller. Every step down the main street was an agony of suspense. The light from the saloon spilled across the dust, and she could hear Wade's booming laugh from within. She didn't dare look. Dr. Mead's office was dimly lit. An old man with weary eyes and ink-stained fingers looked up from a book as she entered. He was thin with a fringe of white hair and a face etched with the memory of too much death and too little sleep. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice, tired but not unkind. I need help," Jocelyn stammered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My brother. He was in a hunting accident. He's wounded. Badly." Dr. Mead sighed the sigh of a man who had heard 1,000 stories and knew most of them were lies. "Where is he?" "He's hiding. He's afraid of the law." The doctor raised a skeptical eyebrow. Most men are for good reason. What kind of trouble is he? And Jocelyn took a breath. The truth was her only currency now. He's in the kind of trouble that gets an innocent man hanged. The kind of trouble Barrett Coleman creates. The mention of that name changed the atmosphere in the room. The doctor's weary expression hardened. He stood up and walked to the window, peering through the grimy glass at the town he served. Coleman, he said the name, tasting like poison. That man's ambition is a sickness. He owns this town, body and soul. He owns the sheriff, the judge, and most of the men who drink in his saloon. So I ask you again, miss, what kind of trouble they say he's a murderer? Jocelyn, said her voice, dropping to a whisper. They say he's an Apache who attacked a wagon train. Dr. Meade turned from the window, his eyes boring into her. He saw the torn dress, the exhaustion in her face, the haunted look in her eyes. And what do you say? I say he's the man who carried me for 3 days across the desert after the men who actually attacked the train left me for dead. The men who work for Barrett Coleman. She let the shawl fall from her head. My name is Jocelyn Coleman. And according to that notice on the sheriff's door, I'm supposed to be dead. The doctor stared, his mouth slightly agape. He had heard the story, of course. The whole town had. A tragic, noble wife murdered by savages. It had been the talk of prosperity for a week, further cementing Coleman's image as a man beset by the perils of the frontier. He walked over to his medical cabinet, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and handed one to her. I believe you, he said simply. I treated a miner last month who lost his arm in a blast at the CMC. He said they were cutting corners on safety supports to get the silver out faster. He was told to keep his mouth shut or his family would be thrown out of their company home. I've seen what this man is capable of. He took a long drink. Your brother, the Apache. Where is he? Jocelyn led Dr. Meade to the blacksmith's forge. Taza was a statue in the darkness, knife in hand, ready to fight or flee. He watched the old doctor approach with deep suspicion. Dr. Meade didn't flinch. He simply raised his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm a healer, he said, looking at Taza. He then looked at the makeshift bandage on Taza's shoulder. And it looks like you need one. Inside the doctor's office with the door locked and the curtains drawn, a strange and desperate council of war was held. Dr. Meade examined Taza's shoulder. The poultice had kept the worst of the infection at bay, but the bullet was still lodged deep inside. It needs to come out, Meade said gravely. Tonight. If it stays in, the fever will kill you for sure. The procedure was brutal. There was no anesthetic, only a leather strap for Taza to bite down on, and the whiskey. Jocelyn held his hand, her knuckles white. She couldn't watch the doctor's probe digging into the raw flesh, but she could feel the tremors of agony that racked Taza's body. He did not make a sound. Not a single cry passed his lips. His stoicism was terrifying, a testament to a life of unimaginable hardship. Jocelyn found herself whispering words of comfort, nonsense, syllables, anything to fill the awful silence of his pain. Finally, with a sickening scrape, Meade extracted the mangled piece of lead and dropped it into a metal bowl. It was a Henry rifle round, same kind of bullet that killed 3 of Coleman's rivals in a dispute over a land claim last year. Meade muttered, cleaning and stitching the wound with practiced hands. Sheriff called it a fair fight, while Taza rested a potent sleeping draught, finally giving him some peace. Meade and Jocelyn talked. He gave her food, bread and cold meat, and she ate like a starving animal. He told her what he knew. Barrett Coleman wasn't in prosperity, but he was expected to arrive in a few days' time. He was coming to oversee a large shipment of silver, and more importantly, to publicly mourn his murdered wife, cementing his heroic, tragic narrative in the eyes of his investors and the territorial government. His entire empire is built on a foundation of lies and bodies, Meade said. Your story. If you could tell it, it could bring him down. But who would believe you? A hysterical woman who looks like she's been living in a cave, siding with an Apache against a man like Barrett Coleman. They'd lock you in an asylum. Then what can I do? Jocelyn asked, despair creeping into her voice. You can't fight him on his terms, the doctor said, his eyes glinting with a shrewd light. He controls the law, the money, and the guns. You have to fight him with the one thing you have that he doesn't. What's that? Dr. Meade looked from Jocelyn's determined face to the sleeping form of the warrior in the next room. The truth. And him. Coleman and his men, they expect the Apache to be a savage. They expect the woman to be a victim. They won't be expecting you to be smart, and they won't be expecting him to be a hunter in their own backyard. A plan began to form a thread of impossible hope. They couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, Coleman's reach would find them. The only way out was through. They had to expose him here, in the town he owned, in front of the people he controlled. When Taza awoke, his mind clear of fever for the first time in weeks, they explained it to him. Dr. Meade spoke no Apache and Taza no English, so Jocelyn became the unlikely translator. She used the words he had taught her combined with charcoal drawings on the floorboards and desperate gestures. She drew a picture of a man with a sneer, Wade. She drew a man with a big belly, the sheriff, and she drew a tall man in a fine suit, a snake with a forked tongue, Barrett Coleman. Then she drew herself speaking and the townspeople listening. She drew Taza not in the shadows, but in the light, a warrior, not a murderer. Taza watched his dark eyes, missing nothing. He understood the danger, but he also understood the objective. It was not just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the truth. He looked at the drawing of Wade, then at his newly stitched shoulder. He picked up the piece of charcoal, and next to the drawing of Wade and Coleman, he drew the smoking ruins of a wickiup. He looked at Jocelyn and nodded. In that dusty, lamplit room surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and whiskey, the three of them, the dead wife, the wanted warrior, and the disillusioned doctor, forged an oath. They would not run. They would stand and fight. Prosperity would live up to its name, but not with Coleman's silver. It would be a prosperity of truth, paid for in courage and, if necessary, in blood. The next 2 days were a blur of tense preparation. Dr. Meade became their eyes and ears, gathering information as he made his rounds. Barrett Coleman was arriving on the noon stagecoach in 2 days. He was planning a memorial service for his dear departed Jocelyn in front of the town hall, a grand public performance of grief. Wade and Pike were his enforcers, drinking heavily at the saloon and boasting about how they'd hunt down the Apache responsible for Mrs. Coleman's death. The town's sheriff, a portly, sweat-stained man named Bartholomew, was firmly in Coleman's pocket. While the doctor gathered intelligence, Taza prepared for war. He moved like a ghost between the doctor's office and the abandoned smithy next door. He did not need a repeating rifle. His weapons were silence, surprise, and the land itself, even this corrupted land of alleys and rooftops. He found discarded scraps of metal in the smithy, which he patiently sharpened into deadly throwing blades. He braided a rope he found into a garret. He studied the layout of the town, noting every shadow, every escape route, every blind corner. He was a hunter, and Main Street was now his hunting ground. Jocelyn's role was the most dangerous. She was the fuse. She wrote a letter addressed to Senator Patterson, the same senator from the disastrous dinner party in San Francisco. In it, she detailed everything: Barrett's abuse, her escape, the faked Apache raid, and his plan to use her death to garner sympathy and political favor while clearing the Apache from the land he coveted. It was her word against his, but it was a start. She gave it to Dr. Meade, who had a contact on the eastbound stage who owed him a favor. It was a message in a bottle, cast into a sea of corruption, but it was something. Her main task, however, was to be the bait. The day of Coleman's arrival dawned hot and still. The whole town of Prosperity seemed to be holding its breath. Main Street was swept clean, and a black-draped podium was set up in front of the town hall. Taza, hidden in the hayloft of the livery stable across the street, was a motionless silhouette in the shadows. Meade stood in the growing crowd, his black bag in his hand, looking for all the world like a concerned citizen. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust. Barrett Coleman stepped out dressed in immaculate black. He was the very picture of tragic dignity. His face was somber, his eyes scanning the crowd of miners and merchants who had gathered. He was a master showman, and this was his stage. He began his speech, his voice resonating with practiced sorrow. He spoke of his beloved Jocelyn, her kindness, her grace. He spoke of the savage wilderness and the need to tame it, the need to bring order and security so that good, decent people would be safe. He pointed to the hills to his mine. "We build a future here," he declared, "a future of prosperity in her name." It was then that Jocelyn made her move. She emerged from the alley beside the general store. She was no longer the bedraggled creature from the desert. Dr. Hoare, Meade had given her a simple, clean dress, and she had washed and brushed her hair. She looked pale and thin, but she was no ghost. She was flesh and blood. She walked slowly, deliberately, into the middle of the street. A murmur went through the crowd. People stared, confused. Barrett paused his speech, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at the interruption. Then he saw her. His composure for one terrifying second completely shattered. His face went white with shock, his mouth opening slightly. It was impossible. He had paid a fortune to ensure she was a corpse rotting under the Arizona sun. "You speak of your wife." Jocelyn's voice rang out clear and strong, amplified by the stunned silence. "But your wife is not dead, Barrett. She is standing right here." The crowd gasped. Wade and Pike, standing near the podium, spun around their hands, dropping to their guns. Sheriff Bartholomew's jaw hung open. Barrett recovered instantly, his mind racing. "What madness is this?" he boomed, pointing a trembling finger at her. "This poor woman is clearly mad, delirious from the sun. My wife is gone, murdered by an Apache savage. Was it an Apache who paid Wade and Pike to throw me from a wagon?" Jocelyn counted her eyes, locking onto his. "Was it a savage who stole my money and left me to die so you could inherit my family's holdings and play the grieving hero?" Wade drew his pistol. "She's lying. She's crazy." But the seeds of doubt were planted. The townspeople looked from Jocelyn's fierce living face to Barrett's suddenly theatrical denial. "Seize her, Barrett," commanded the sheriff. "She's hysterical." Sheriff Bartholomew, sweating profusely, started to move forward, but he was too slow. The reckoning had begun. From the roof of the mercantile, one of Taza's sharpened metal blades whistled through the air, embedding itself in the wooden post, inches from the sheriff's head. He yelped and stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. Chaos erupted. Pike raised his rifle, scanning the rooftops. "He's up there." But Taza was already gone. He dropped from the back of the building into the alley. His target was Wade. Wade was the one who had led the raid on his village. Wade was the one who laughed. As the crowd scattered screaming, Jocelyn ran for cover behind the water trough. Barrett, his face a mask of pure fury, pulled a derringer from his coat. His performance was over. The monster was unleashed. Wade, seeing Jocelyn, started towards her. "I'll finish the job this time, you witch," He never made it. Taza emerged from the alley behind him, a silent, avenging spirit. Wade sensed him a second too late. He turned his eyes wide with shock as Taza's knife slid between his ribs. There was no sound but a wet gasp. Wade crumpled to the ground, his sneer frozen on his face forever. Pike roared in anger and fired his rifle towards the alley, the bullet splintering the doorframe. This was the distraction Taza needed. While Pike was focused on the alley, Taza had already scaled a rain barrel and was back on the roof, circling around. Meanwhile, Barrett advanced on Jocelyn, his fine suit now covered in dust. "You have ruined everything," he hissed, his eyes crazed. "I should have killed you myself." He raised the derringer. Before he could fire, Dr. Meade, who had been moving through the chaos, swung his heavy medical bag with all his might, striking Coleman's arm. The gun clattered into the dust. Coleman roared in pain and backhanded the old doctor, sending him sprawling. Now it was just Barrett and Jocelyn. He lunged for her, his hands outstretched, aiming for her throat. She was not the same woman he had brutalized in San Francisco. She was a survivor. She sidestepped and kicked out her boot, connecting with his knee. He howled in pain and stumbled. From the stable loft, Pike finally spotted Taza. He brought his rifle up. But in that split second, Taza threw his last projectile. It wasn't a blade. It was a heavy blacksmith's hammer he'd found. It spun end over end, striking Pike in the chest with sickening force. The rifle discharged into the sky as Pike toppled backward from the loft landing, with a bone-jarring crunch in an empty horse stall. All that was left was Barrett Coleman. He scrambled for his derringer in the dust. As his fingers closed around it, a shadow fell over him. Taza dropped silently from the saloon awning landing, as softly as a cat. He stood between Barrett and Jocelyn. He held only his knife. He didn't need anything else. Barrett on his knees looked up at the Apache warrior. He saw no mercy in those eyes, only the reflection of his own sins. He saw the ghosts of a slaughtered family. "Savage," Barrett choked out. Taza didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was condemnation enough. The fight was over. The townspeople slowly emerged from their hiding places, staring at the scene. Wade and Pike were dead. The great Barrett Coleman was on his knees, disarmed and defeated by a lone Apache, and the wife he had declared dead. The truth, it turned out, didn't need a lawman or a judge. Sometimes it just needed to be given a chance to fight. The dust settled on Main Street, revealing a tableau of silent judgment. Barrett Coleman knelt in the dirt, a broken man. Taza stood over him, not as an executioner, but as a silent testament to the justice the Prairie had delivered. The whimpering of Sheriff Bartholomew from under the boardwalk was the only sound. Jocelyn walked forward and picked up the derringer. Looking at the man who had been her husband, she felt only a vast, empty pity. "It's over, Barrett," she said, her voice steady. Her words broke the spell. Dr. Meade, nursing a bruised jaw, stepped into the center of the street. "This man is a murderer and a liar," he announced to the stunned crowd. "This woman is Jocelyn Coleman, and that Apache is the man who saved her life." The townspeople, freed from their fear, surged forward. The great Barrett Coleman was just a man, and now he was theirs to hold accountable. But Jocelyn and Taza knew that the official law was a fickle thing, easily bought and sold. This town, even with its monster unmasked, was not their home. As the citizens of Prosperity began to reclaim their town, Jocelyn and Taza slipped away to the livery stable. Dr. Meade met them there with 2 saddled horses packed with supplies. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. "Somewhere a person can start over." Jocelyn replied, her eyes on the endless horizon. She looked at Taza. His quest for vengeance was over, but his world remained lost. He had only the trail ahead. The doctor looked at him, a question in his eyes. Taza met his gaze, then looked to Jocelyn. He placed a hand over his heart. "Shabika," he said. "My path." He then motioned to include her. "Nai-e." Together. Their paths were one now. Jocelyn offered the doctor a grateful nod. "Thank you, Henry. You two gave this town back its soul," he replied. "Go. Live." They mounted their horses. They were a strange pair, the society wife turned survivor, and the Chiricahua warrior turned guardian. Scarred, weary, and alone in the world except for each other. They rode out of prosperity, not looking back. Their journey hadn't ended. It was simply taking a new turn. They were two fugitives from a world that had tried to erase them, riding toward a future they would have to forge themselves together under a different dawn. The story of Jocelyn Bellwether and the Apache warrior Taza is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a testament to the indomitable strength of the human spirit in the face of absolute betrayal. It shows us that heroes are not always the ones with the shiny badge or the fastest gun. Sometimes they are the outcasts, the wounded, and the forgotten, who find the courage to stand for the truth when no one else will. Their alliance, born of shared pain and forged in the crucible of the prairie, reminds us that our common humanity can bridge any divide. If this story of survival justice and the forging of an unbreakable bond moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button below. Share it with someone who appreciates a story with real heart and grit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the dusty annals of history. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.